But who is our speaker? He's president of the MBG Information Services, the Washington-based business information, analysis, and forecasting firm. He writes the business and financial trends section of the Harvard Business Review. He was also a featured speaker, get this, at President Clinton's Little Rock Economic Summit. I can hear 15 questions warming up on the tarmac out there right now. He's done important economic research for Johns Hopkins, also important policy studies for Congress. He has spent much time studying Maryland. But as a practical matter, what does all this add up to? If this were a commercial, and I assure you it's not TV back there, it's not commercial, I would say this. If you wanted an answer on almost any economic question, from the economic future of Rostov to the economic future of Glen Burnie, you'd pick up the telephone and dial MBG Information in Washington and ask for Charlie McMillion. He would have the answer you want. Dr. McMillion, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe not the answer you want, but an answer nonetheless. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be back in Baltimore. It will be especially difficult tonight to keep my attention on the subject at hand because of the absolutely fabulous view that I have. It's really very clever of them to set the seats in this direction. You would not be able to pay any attention to me whatsoever if it were reversed, and you had the view out over you that I do. It's very nice to be back in Baltimore now. As some of you know, I've just returned from a month in Europe, a very interesting month for me. 3 years ago, on New Year's Eve, 1989, 1990, I stood on the Berlin Wall and then danced under the Brandenburg Gate as the clock struck midnight. It was a time of enormous optimism in Europe, of course, and really throughout the world. Times have changed, as of course they always do. The mood now in Europe is really quite grim. It's even worse than in the late 1970s, during that period of Eurosclerosis that we once talked about. In addition to the war that's now going on in Europe, there's been an explosion of ancient ethnic hatreds throughout Europe, as well, of course, as in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. Government deficits in Europe are generally larger than ours are here in the United States, and unemployment is about 11% across Europe, 22% in Spain, extremely high in Europe. The atmosphere has changed quite a bit. It's also changed, of course, very dramatically in Japan in recent years. When President Clinton goes to the G7 meeting in a few weeks, he will be the most popular leader at the meeting, by far. This is not a good time to be a politician. And of course, every country, really every country in the world, is looking to the United States for many forms of leadership. The most surprising aspect of this past very interesting month in Europe for me was learning the extent to which very prominent and well-informed leaders in business and academia and government are all looking to the U.S., looking to us here in the U.S. and our economy to pull Europe out of its worst recession in 50 years. It's quite a responsibility. So this evening, I may depart just a little bit briefly to outline a few key aspects of the economy here in Maryland and in the U.S., and then open it up for wider discussion. I'll touch on a number of things in my prepared statement before we open it up. I'll touch on a number of things. This evening, but I want to sketch out really three key important points. The first is that the recent recession was really very badly misunderstood here in Maryland and around the country. Consumers and business are more, not less, confident than conditions justify. Those who have bet their banks and their businesses or their careers on a rising economic tide that would lift all ships have been bitterly disappointed. On the other hand, those who have developed strategies around the real world have generally prospered even in these last 2 or 3 years. Let me back up just a little bit and emphasize to you that, in my view at least, Marylanders and really everyone else in this global economy of ours face an historic disparity between private opportunity and public crisis. I hope I can elaborate on this a little bit during the discussion, but the revolution in technology and globalization have created enormous, really I think perhaps unprecedented, opportunities to energetic and talented companies and individuals. My own industry, information services, has been completely transformed in just the past few years. The computers that many of you carry in your briefcases today each have greater capacity than the computer centers at major universities just a very few years ago. And of course, when you connect a telephone, and now you don't even need a wire, when you connect a telephone to these things, the capacity is absolutely unlimited. But overall, so the opportunities for energetic and talented firms and individuals has never been greater around the world, certainly here in Maryland. But overall, economic growth is not keeping up with population. Today's opportunity is largely in taking away market share or jobs or income from someone else. So in my view, rekindling and sustaining economic growth is the principal challenge that community and world leaders now face. But this dichotomy, I think, is extremely important to keep in mind. A world of opportunities, and I'm not just, those of you who have known me over the years know that I'm not just being optimistic to be optimistic. Incredible opportunities around the world for energetic and talented firms and individuals, while on the other hand, virtually every government around the world is in deep, deep trouble. So the first point that I'll like to make tonight is that this recent recession has been really very badly misunderstood here in Maryland and around the country, and therefore around the world, our recession. The second point that I'd like to make is that our long-term structural economic problems are really far more severe than most people realize. We're still the largest and in many ways the most dynamic. Our flexibility, our strengths in this economy here in Maryland and around the country are really second to none in the world. But we do have severe, long-term structural problems that are going to take some time to straighten out. And they are more severe even than most people realize. The third point is that the combination of these two, the short and the long-term difficulties, inhibit the strength and the durability of this current recovery that we're in here in Maryland and around the country. There is now no apparent economic engine capable of driving our economy to sustained, healthy growth. The popular wisdom, or at least popular in some circles, wisdom that what you need to do is stay alive till 95 is, in my view, a prescription for disaster, because it overlooks the enormous opportunities that are out there and available today, and because it ignores the new difficulties that may very well be just around the corner. So these are the 3 points that I'd like to make. Can everybody understand me? By the way, I'm from Texas. I always talk slow, and I should probably apologize. After a month in Europe, I've been talking even slower, so I'll try to speed it up. But it's You know, it's not surprising that those who have not understood the U.S., the Maryland and the U.S. economy for many years still don't understand it. But it is troubling that despite last year's election, George Bush lost, Bill Clinton won, and skyrocketing bankruptcy rates, by far the worst since the Depression. It's troubling that conventional wisdom is still dominated by the same, I call them con artists. These people didn't understand, or these people didn't see the last recession coming. They didn't know it was here even when we were in the middle of it. And now they don't think it was really such a big deal. They're 0 for 3 in forecasting a strong recovery and still insist that prosperity is just around the corner. But the thing that has really annoyed me is that, unable to reconcile their view, their very complacent view of the economy, with low levels of business and consumer confidence, many of these pundits and many economists have recently begun to ridicule Americans as overly pessimistic. Some of them even claim that we Americans are inherently pessimistic. Now, maybe it's because I'm from Texas, but this makes no sense to me. We're sometimes accused of being naively carefree, but inherently pessimistic nonsense. Americans are, almost by definition, optimistic and courageous, gung-ho to a fault. But this notion that I'm sure you've heard many times, this notion about American pessimism is based almost entirely on the relatively mild unemployment rate in recent years. This is wildly misleading. The unemployment rate has remained relatively low here in Maryland and around the country, not because of job growth, but because those without jobs are not entering the labor force or are dropping out of the labor force. For example, nationwide, this past January, employment fell by 240,000, but the unemployment rate improved from 7.3 to 7.1%. Employment dropped by 240,000, but unemployment rate dropped as well. In April, a couple of months ago, employment fell by 150,000 nationwide, but the unemployment rate stayed steady. How could this be? Well, because in January, 500,000 people dropped out of the labor force, and in April, 90,000 dropped out of the labor force. In fact, although our population has grown by about 2 million since last July, until this May, the labor force had actually contracted. Now, there's no government conspiracy here. People without jobs are actually telling the surveyors that, no, I don't have a job, and no, I'm not looking for work. Maybe daycare is so expensive and available jobs so poor that people are making the rational choice to stay home. Maybe lots of people actually want to take early retirement from the military, from companies and other things. Whatever the combination of factors, what is clear is that job growth here in Maryland and throughout the country is not keeping up with population. And for the first time, again, since the Depression, since World War II, real after-tax incomes have now been stagnant for 4 years. I hope that each of you have one of these handouts. I hope there were enough, and I also understand that looking at economic charts and graphs are most people's one of their favorite things to do. So I'll make this as quick and painless as I possibly can, but this will help me from getting bogged down in a lot of data while still being somewhat specific. If you'll open your handouts to the first page of charts, the one that begins with job growth in Maryland, there's some aspects of Maryland's recent economic performance that might be of interest. The recession, of course, here in Maryland has really been quite severe. You see, despite the myth about Maryland being immune from national business cycles, that in fact, over the last 40 or 50 years, Maryland reflects national business cycles quite well. But this recession was much more severe in Maryland even than the 1982 dip in employment that you can see there, and also in the 1975 dip in employment. So we had recessions here in those years, but it was much more severe in this recession than in past recessions. It was also very broad-based. One of my longtime concerns with the Maryland economy has been that some of our industries for the future have been particularly hard hit, and they've been hard hit for a long time. The electronics industry, for example, which was one of the principal areas of growth during the 1970s, actually peaked in 1984 and has been dropping for some time. Employment in the electronics industry has been dropping for some time. Up till today, 1 in 3 jobs in the electronics sector in Maryland have been lost in just the last 4 years. Of course, construction, of course, manufacturing generally, many other areas of the economy, but some of the areas which are really quite important to the economy at large. I'll come back to this, but turn the page, if you would, to the set of charts that's titled Prime Interest Rates, and let me just walk you through some of the key national indicators of why this recession has hurt so much for many people. Again, those who have been taking advantage of the downturn have actually done quite well, but for the broad population, certainly for state and local revenues and for federal revenue, this recession has been quite severe. And one of the reasons that we've not come out of it is that interest rates, while they have come down very significantly, in real terms, that is, that's the top chart there, in real terms, that is, the price of money after inflation, just like everything else, while it has come down, real interest rates are really still not all that low. Many of you, like me, I hope, have refinanced your houses lately and are reaping enormous benefits from the fall. But one of the key engines that normally drives an economy after a recession is housing starts. And here in Maryland and really around the country, housing has continued to be very weak. And one of the reasons, and I'll get to other reasons later, but one of the reasons is that while real interest rates have come down quite a bit, real interest rates are still actually reasonably high by any standard prior to 1981. So it's don't get me wrong, and it's very, very important that they are down and that they stay down, but they're not as low as you might think. The second chart, though, in the middle of the page, I think may be more instructive in understanding the current national climate here in the United States, and that is that this recession that started in July of 1990 nationwide was actually quite severe. There was employment loss in this recession was greater than it was even in the 1982 recession. You can follow the lines there. That bottom line is this current recession. But perhaps more importantly, now, of course, unemployment remained very low, particularly here in Maryland. But employment loss nationwide, and especially in Maryland, was very severe in this recession. But the worst part is that there's been very little bounce back after the recession is over. Remember, we've been out of this recession for more than 2 years. Even in Maryland, we've been out for more than 2 years. Well, maybe in Maryland about 2 years. The bottom chart, just for some context, gives you a sense of the toll that this has taken on our businesses. And this does not include savings and loans and banks, the much publicized failure rate of some of our financial institutions. This is just in business and industrial firms. And I might add that those of us still holding worthless accounts receivable from some of these, that the liabilities from these bankruptcies is even steeper than this chart. So I hope that I'm making some progress. I could go on, but in emphasizing that this recession was actually quite severe in the nation, and of course it was worse in Maryland than it was in the nation as a whole. Throughout most of this period, job loss in Maryland has been one of the 5 or 6, 7 or 8 worst states in the country. So we've really taken quite a hit here in Maryland. But this brings me to my second point, the longer-term structural issues. And if you would turn the page to the chart headed economic growth. I promise I'll speed up a little now. This top chart may actually not be as damning as it first appears. You know, in China right now, the real economic growth rate in China is about 12%. It won't always be 12%. We might wish it would be. But economies have a way of going through periods of takeoff and then maturing, and they slow down a bit. Now, the degree to which it is slowing down, the U.S. Economic growth, may be a problem, but the fact that it is slowing somewhat may not be such a problem. Depends on what your business is. But the second chart, productivity growth, the decline in the rate of growth of productivity is quite a problem in the U.S. Now, for some of you economists, there may be some measurement problems, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but the second chart is really quite important, that the rate of growth of U.S. productivity has been slowing very dramatically for a generation. And finally, the bottom chart about job growth, again, this too may not be as damning as it appears. My generation, the baby boom generation, is out there in the workforce for the most part. Women who were not in the workforce in such high numbers in the 1950s and 60s were absorbed into the workforce in the 1970s. So whereas our national economy had to produce about 3 million jobs a year in the 70s and the first part of the 80s, really now if it produces 1.5 million a year, we're doing okay. So the slowdown in job growth is not necessarily, again, economy-wide, such a problem. But if you'll turn to the next set of charts, this really is, I think, the page that most clearly explains, at least to me, why George Bush lost last year, why Bill Clinton won, and why Ross Perot is such a power in Maryland and throughout our economy. And that is that real per capita income in the U.S., the rate of growth, has been slowing very dramatically again for a generation, but for the last 4 years, these are 4-year rolling averages, for the last 4 years there has been virtually no growth in real per capita income. And remember, these are averages. In the top 5 or 10%, the Michael Milkens even still are doing quite well. The 90% of the population has actually seen a decline in their after-tax, after-inflation per capita income for 4 years. This is putting enormous stress on households. The second chart there will indicate that despite the stress that households have felt over the last several years, they have tried their darndest to continue spending. Back in the 1970s, when we first began to be concerned about the competitiveness of the American or the Maryland economy, one of the principal concerns, one of the things we taught, one of the things I learned in the 70s, early part of the 70s, one of the principal problems with this economy was our low savings rate. That was when we only saved 7 or 8% of our after-tax income. Japan saves about 20%, Germany saves about 15%. We in the U.S. were saving, here in Maryland, we're saving about 7 or 8% of our disposable income. Terrible. How can we have investment if we don't save more? Well, In recent years, that 7 or 8% has collapsed to 4 or 5%. Again, as consumers have worked as hard as they can, spending down their savings to try to keep their standard of living up. The bottom chart indicates that, of course, there's one other way that you can keep spending even if your income is stagnant or falling, and that is you can go into debt. And I've used a consistent series here. I've used the same data here, but it may, in fact, it is somewhat misleading. We have not, in fact, had the improvement over the last few years in our very high level of consumer indebtedness. What happened in 1986, we had a major change in the tax laws of the United States. We did away with tax deductions for installment debt, but we retained the mortgage tax deduction. So consumers have, in a very major way, shifted from credit cards to home equity loans. So if you correct for that, there have been studies at the Chicago Fed and a number of academics. If you correct for this shift in the structure of borrowing, and also the shift in the structure of the way we acquire our automobiles, over the last 5 or 6 years, in a major way, we've moved from buying to leasing automobiles. And of course, a lease, you don't own anything, so it doesn't show up as a debt payment. In any case, this line, properly adjusted for the change in the structure of borrowing, it would show that Americans are still as deeply in debt as ever before, and far more than they ever were before 6 or 8 years ago. So you get the picture of the American consumer, the American voter, as having their household budgets very tightly squeezed because they're real after tax, I'll come back to that. Incomes have not grown for 4 years. In fact, in most cases, the great majority, virtually everyone who considers themselves middle class, their incomes have been 90% percentile and down. Their real incomes have not grown over the last 4 years. Their savings have fallen very dramatically, and their debt levels have gone up very, very high. This is the reason that George Bush's campaign of no new taxes was, even though finally a losing campaign, was quite popular. We'll come back to the constraints that this stress on household budgets puts on policymakers in just a minute. Let me just very quickly, the next set of charts, there's nothing wrong with indebtedness. There are a number of bankers and brokers here. Debt is one of the engines that drives a good, healthy capitalist economy. I borrowed to go to school. I borrowed to buy my home. I borrowed to start my business. Debt is good. Well, it's good if you're investing in productive and appreciable or appreciating assets. It is not good if you do it strictly to consume. And that's what the United States was doing throughout most of the last, actually quite some time, but particularly in recent years. So the top chart shows the dramatic fall off in real investment in plant and equipment in the United States, which again is one of the reasons that our level of productivity is coming down. The bottom two charts, one just emphasizes that the U.S. continues to have a substantial trade problem. Last year, our economy grew by just over 2%. If we had had a balance in our trade accounts, we would have had growth by about 3%. It does mean 2 or 3 million jobs in the U.S. It is quite important and getting worse again. Let me leave off this bottom chart and just ask you to turn the page, because this is one of the real bright spots in the Maryland economy over the last couple of years, is that Maryland's merchandise exports have been one of the leaders in the nation for the last 2 years. You can see that, again, merchandise exports have grown by more than 50% here in Maryland since 1990. That's really quite extraordinary. And let me just be sure that everybody understands, we only measure physical things, agriculture, oil and gas, products, physical products. The U.S. government, the Census Bureau, does a very poor job in measuring trade in services. And Maryland is a services state. We'll talk about just how heavily dependent Maryland is on services. But the extraordinary growth in Maryland's export, you need to understand, came, there were a lot of firms involved, a lot of small firms have been working very hard at export promotion, and but the lion's share came from a very few firms, and principally from that minivan operation just down the road here. As you see in the next page, most of this increase has come from increase in transportation equipment, which is largely these minivans, and largely going to Egypt and Germany over the last couple of years. But exports continue to be merchandise exports continue to be a somewhat bright spot. One of the things that has cushioned the Maryland economy and needs to continue to play a very important role in Maryland's growth in the future. Maryland's growth in merchandise exports, though, is really particularly impressive in light of the very small and declining role that manufacturing plays in the overall Maryland economy. And there's a lot of numbers on the back page, but if there are questions about it, we can talk. The key thing that I wanted there, in addition to just letting you have it so that you could have a sense of what the structure of Maryland's economy is and how it's changed over the last generation, is that manufacturing now accounts for less than 8% of overall employment in the Maryland economy. Maryland now has more than twice as many jobs in retail sales as it does in manufacturing. Sometime within the next year or 18 months, Maryland will have more jobs in health care, health services, just in health services, than in manufacturing. So manufacturing is a very small part of the Maryland economy. It's a small part of the national economy, but Maryland has only about half the relative size manufacturing base that the nation as a whole has. So in light of that, its sustained merchandise exports is really quite remarkable. But as I indicated, because of the very small manufacturing base, small and declining manufacturing base in Maryland, professional services, accountants, software, legal, financial, engineering, architects, all the things that I would be willing to bet the vast majority of people in here do, is absolutely essential to the Maryland economy, and it needs support from every direction that it possibly can get it. One of the key concerns here in Maryland needs to be the outflow of talent. Maryland has gone through cycles over the last generation. It grew faster than the nation in the 60s, slower in the 70s, and much faster in the 80s. Now, so far in the 90s, it's growing much slower again. When it was growing fast, a lot of talent poured in or stayed here in Maryland, here in Baltimore. In the 70s, when it was having very difficult times, a lot of talent left or didn't come. In the 80s, again, you had a lot of talent pouring into Baltimore and pouring into to Maryland. The real task for this community is to hang on to that talent and to continue to recruit more. Let me not get ahead of myself, though, and just finish up with the final point that these short and long-term problems with the Maryland economy and the national economy inhibit the recovery and threaten its duration. There is now, here in Maryland and throughout the national economy, no apparent economic engine that is capable of driving sustained job and income growth. Holding your breath and trying to stay alive until 95 is therefore a prescription for disaster. Anyone who tries to hold their breath and wait until the good old days return will find themselves so far behind in the learning curve and having missed so many opportunities that it will be very difficult to catch up. Now is the time for carefully planned but bold actions at every level of your firm and your career and for public policy. The good news, of course, is that here in Baltimore and nationally, the recession of 1990-1991 is over. The bad news is that it's been over for 2 years. We should now stop looking back so much and begin to look forward to the next cyclical downturn. Recall, if you will, that in the last 40 years, here in Maryland and throughout the country, we've had 8 recessions. That is a recession about every 5 years. The last recession began about 3 years ago. Prudent management would, nobody forecasts a recession, at least not this far out, but prudent management would anticipate the possibility of another downturn in 1995, 1996. Let me just say that the principal sources of jobs and income growth over the last several years here in Maryland and around the country, aside from government deficits, have been health care, improved net exports, and state and local government employment. Even here in Maryland, state and local government employment. Each of these, because of fiscal stresses, because of the problems in Europe and worldwide, because of the budget deficits, each of these seem likely to weaken substantially in the near term. Now, there are plenty of hot spots for growth. Information technologies, the Rocky Mountain region, China, and there are, as I indicated earlier, unlimited opportunities to take away market share. But at least for me, and if other people have other views, I'd love to hear it, it is very hard to find sufficient engines for sustainable economic and income growth as you look out across the economy here in Maryland and nationwide. I'll stop here and hope I have stimulated some issues for discussion. But to summarize, I wanted to make 3 points. The first is that the recent recession here in Maryland and around the country has been really quite severe. You've really taken quite a shot. Don't blame yourselves, don't blame business confidence, don't blame consumer confidence. We've had a lousy economy. The second is we continue to be the largest, the strongest, the most productive in many ways, the richest country in the world, but we have serious long-term structural problems that will take some time to work out. And finally, these short and long-term problems are going to inhibit the strength of this recovery. Don't expect a sharp uptick in growth anytime soon. This does not mean there are not opportunities. There are lots of them. Go out and make them. The time is now for each of us really to get to work. We need to remember, it seems to me, that in this century we have seen the end of 3 world wars. At the end of the First World War, we really didn't approach it very systematically. We didn't work together very well with our former allies around the world. Organizations like this were not particularly prevalent. There wasn't a lot of emphasis on internationalization, and we really screwed it up. We had a very difficult time after the First World War. At the end of the Second World War, we had learned some lessons. We really had a much more systematic approach. We worked with our allies. Groups like this began all around the world. international cooperation was seen and valued as the absolutely essential element that it is. And as a result, we've had 40 or 50 pretty good years. Now, at the end of the Third World War in this century, the Cold War, we absolutely have to be sure that all of us, in our own ways, in our different aspects of life, work as hard as we can to be patient, to maintain cooperation, global cooperation, tolerance around our own communities and around the world, to be sure that once we get through these difficult few years that I believe will follow, that the technologies that we've created over the last generation will lift us up to a new level of living standard and prosperity really that the world has never seen. I guess my view is that the world really faces some difficult challenges. This is really serious business in my view. Clearly the stakes are enormously high. In Europe and throughout the world, economic conditions are difficult. Markets are not keeping up with populations. Political tensions are rising. It almost makes me feel good about the problems that we face here in Maryland and in the United States when I consider the difficulties facing people in much of the rest of the world. But it also means that we cannot fail to provide leadership. We cannot fail to change our own economic direction and to sustain this precarious recovery that we now have. But of course, we're Americans, and we know that we will succeed. Thank you, and I hope I've generated some questions.
3 questions. One, why do you leave Westinghouse off of charts from a Westinghouse employee? And secondly, what do you think are the causes for the loss of our manufacturing base, and what can we do about this?
Yes, all 3 good questions. The first one is just a definitional question. There was a change in the SIC code. That's how the government classifies each plant. And Westinghouse was moved, at least for purposes of government data, from electronics to precision instruments in 1988. So it just doesn't show up in the data, in that set of data. The second question is really quite important, I think, about the decline of manufacturing really all over the country. But in fact, we did a study last year, I think, of manufacturing throughout the country, and I was surprised to discover that in the 1980s, the percentage decline in the manufacturing base in Maryland was the greatest in the nation. And it started the 1980s with a very small base. I think because of Sparrows Point and because of other things, people often think of Maryland as being heavily, certainly Baltimore, being heavily manufacturing. It really has never been that way. Hasn't had as much manufacturing percentage-wise as the nation as a whole ever, I don't think, as far back as data go. But in recent years, it has particularly had problems, even worse than the nation as a whole. The nation as a whole had problems in the 80s because interest rates were, real interest rates, as you have a chart there, real interest rates were quite high, and if you were the treasurer of a firm, what are you going to do? Are you going to bet money on drilling a hole out in West Texas, or on buying new plant or equipment, or are you going to buy government securities or other financial instruments and take your 10 or 12 or 14% and not have any risk? Most of us as individual investors in our pensions and funds and other things did that. A lot of companies did that. There was not much investing going on, partly because of these high real interest rates, partly because of competitive forces. The U.S., particularly in the mid-'80s, the dollar spiked, and it was very difficult for American companies that compete to compete with the low costs in other countries just because of the high value of the dollar. So there were a lot of financial things going on in the 80s that drove the reduction in American manufacturing and here in Maryland as well. There's one beneficial thing, which is productivity growth. That is, how many people does it take to produce a given amount of output? Productivity growth, while weak, has continued in manufacturing, and so it takes fewer people to produce the same amount or even greater amount of goods. So those are the general reasons nationwide. Here in Maryland, it's particularly the defense build down, or at least the stop in the increase of in the defense industry. And many of our electronics and precision instruments were geared to defense products, as your Westinghouse knows so well. So we were hit especially hard because of that. Also, this area was particularly dependent upon commercial construction, again, as many in this audience know, during the 1980s, and the difficulties that the commercial construction industry have had in the last 2 or 3 years is also contributing to the decline. But there are financial aspects, international competitive aspects, and then just structural due to the mix of industries that we happen to have here. It used to be a real benefit to be close to the Pentagon, but now after the Cold War it's a little bit of a problem, and it'll take a while to adjust. The last question about the industries that we should be pushing, I think that we should continue to push manufacturing, but all manufacturing, not just a small subset of new industries. It's very easy for companies to cherry pick our successes in new industries. Some of the greatest successes in Maryland, truthfully, have been brick makers. I mean, if you want to see a high-tech operation, go out here to the, where is he? Go out here to the coal piers. The real advances that these technologies have created for us are, of course, in new products, but really very importantly in the process by which we produce traditional industries, whether it's shipping coal or building bricks out in Hagerstown, or steel or new materials or other things. So a range of manufacturing products, but it is very important that we hang on to, here in Maryland, hang on to the talent that is here. This is an unbelievably rich talent pool, but it's going to have to change from largely defense-related to commercially related. And I've gone much longer than I meant to with this response, but it has to do with a cultural change as well as one type of widget for another. So there are a lot of changes that this community has to go through, and it is bad advice that you are sometimes given that, well, things are difficult, but the structure is okay. Wrong. Things are difficult, but there are enormous opportunities out there. Things are difficult for everybody. And this is the time to be aggressive and to be going after those opportunities. The structure is going to have to undergo some radical changes, both the organization of individual firms and the structure of industry here in this region. And you know, if everybody will get behind this in their own firms as well as in the organizations that you're all members of and push this thing, you know, change can be our friend. But change is going to happen. And it will be disruptive, but it can be very beneficial if we stay as high up on the curve as we currently are. Sorry.
How much emphasis is there in this community upon environmental activities?
You know, I'm sure there are many people in this room that are better, you know, prepared to answer that question than I am. I don't know. We need to have much more discussion within all areas of our community about costs and benefits of all sorts of environmental, health and safety, many important aspects of the way we live our lives. We want to be sure to keep our communities as livable as we possibly can. That's one of the real benefits that we in the United States, and we certainly in this Washington, I live in Washington, but we in this Baltimore-Washington corridor have, is the fabulous quality of life in this area. The Chesapeake Bay, the mountains, I mean, this is a wonderful place to live, and it is perhaps our principal asset. Perhaps even as great as the talent. The talent can leave in a hurry. But our just really fabulous quality of life here has to be maintained, but it has to be done so with a very keen eye toward costs and benefits.
Would you give your opinion on NAFTA and its impact upon the American and Maryland economies?
Again, an excellent question, and one for which there is, obviously no definitive response. I'm reminded, of course, of the senator who told his staff, "I'm tired of all this briefing material speculating about the future. I don't want any more speculating about the future. I want facts." Let me just say that I think a number of serious mistakes have been made in recent years by overreaching. I think that Chancellor Kohl now in Germany understands that he was too ambitious in trying to integrate the eastern sector too quickly. Parity of East and West German Deutschmarks, and these things take time. Let me just say that when Spain and Portugal were integrated into the European community, it took 7 years, and it was not done without quite a bit of problems, and it was done at a period of relative prosperity in Europe. And Spain and Portugal, the standard of living in Spain and Portugal, the average wage rate in Spain and Portugal was about 30% below the average in the European community. The average standard of living and wage rate in Mexico is perhaps 20% of, wait a minute, did I say that right? About Spain and Portugal was 30% below, that is, it was 70% of the wage rates in Europe. Mexico is about 20% of wage rates in the United States. Now, technology is like Pandora's box. You know, there's no way to stop this thing, even if we wanted to. And my own view is that the principal force that led to the destruction of the former Soviet Union was protectionism, was that they were unable to keep up with the very rapid, very dynamic change in technology that has occurred the last 10 or 15 years with this information and technological computer revolution. It is very important that the United States not become protectionist. Again, even if we wanted to, and it would be very difficult with the technologies today to do that. Protectionism is also a prescription for suicide. However, as far as we can, we have to take steps like NAFTA and integrating very different cultures as ours in a very pragmatic way. Germany is in deep trouble right now. It had to be difficult. The former Soviet Union is in deep trouble right now. It had to be difficult. But I think their problems have been compounded by overreaching. I think we need to do it. We need to do it in a orderly, pragmatic way. And it will take some time if it's done right.
Did you want to comment upon that was one, we've gotten into the Los Angeles race, which is fascinating in many ways, and the observation was made that difficulties in creating new jobs, bureaucratic encumbrances is a problem. I don't know whether you want to comment upon that.
Yeah, briefly, I think that one of the things that, and one of the reasons that I supported President Clinton is that he ran on a campaign of reinventing government. It is not so much the intention of government as making it work. People very often argue that tax rates in the United States, corporate tax rates, individual tax rates, are not nearly as high as they are in Europe, particularly when you consider what you get for it.
They have higher unemployment.
Well, I mean, at the moment they do, but that, I mean, the issue to me is what you get for your tax dollar, and I continue to be hopeful. You know, as I said earlier, we Americans are infinitely optimistic that that we will see at the national level and hopefully throughout state and local governments reinventing government, so that you know, there's a lot of regulation that really needs to occur. I mean, however many of these syringes in Pepsi cans are hoaxes, apparently one or two of them were real. There is quite a bit of regulation that is needed, but it doesn't need to be so heavy-handed and so expensive on those of us trying to run a business. And I think you're absolutely right. The misregulation in the United States has, but if you think it's bad here, you should spend some time in Europe. The United States regulatory system, labor laws, virtually all of our laws are infinitely flexible compared with Europe. Europe is going to take some time to adjust.
There again, their unemployment rate is 50% higher than ours.
Unfortunately, I can't repeat that comment because it'll produce another extension of our meeting. One of the terrible things about these sessions is that there's so much more to explore than we can do by approximately 7:10 in the evening. So with a sense of frustration that we can't take advantage of your wisdom any longer, let me thank you very, very much for being good enough to be with us.